All right, I'll give everyone just a few moments to get on the Zoom call and we'll get started here in a minute. All right, looks like we're getting a good number of people in the webinar. Well, I just want to say um, hello to everyone and thank you for joining for today's webinar. This is our third annual Field Inclusive Week, and we're really excited for you to meet our speaker in a moment. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Lauren Gonzalez. I use she, her pronouns. I am a PhD candidate at NC State studying forestry and entomology. I'm a member and volunteer of Field Inclusive, which is a nonprofit working towards amplifying and supporting marginalized and historically excluded biologists and researchers whose professional work is in the outdoors. And just so everybody is aware, today's webinar is going to be recorded, and these recordings will be posted on our YouTube channel throughout the week. So be sure that you follow us there for easy access to these recordings, and make sure that you tune in for the entirety of this webinar so that you can be entered into to win a prize pack from Low Country Marine Mammal Network. And that winner will be announced at the end of this webinar. I will be introducing our speaker in a moment, but I have to, Field Inclusive would like to recognize and give special thanks to our sponsors of Field Inclusive Week 2025, the Nature Conservancy, North Carolina chapter, the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, Advanced Geo Partnership, the Sierra Club, the North Carolina chapter, and 5 individual sponsors. So thank you for coming on board as our sponsors for Field Inclusive Week this year and being dedicated to promoting and supporting a more inclusive outdoors. It's through organizations like yours and the many individuals who donate to support Field Inclusive's mission that we can continue our goals in raising awareness when it comes to social field safety issues by hosting events like Field Inclusive Week, as well as providing financial support to our panelists, speakers, and marginalized and historically excluded individuals who professionally work outdoors. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's discussion. Parker Hughes is a third-year PhD student studying ecology and evolutionary biology at NC State. He specifically studies the evolution of the visual system and is currently interested in fish eyes. He really enjoys his research and he's been able to present at conferences such as Evolution, the 11th International Conference of, I'm an entomologist, so I'm about to mess this one up, poeciclid biologists, and the Society of Integrative and Comparative Biology. In his free time, he loves getting outdoors and watching football. So a huge welcome and special thanks to Parker today for agreeing to facilitate this conversation. And for everyone in the audience, please feel free to submit questions for Parker for the Q&A portion, which will be towards the end of our discussion today. So Parker, I'm going to go ahead and pass it along to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah, great introduction. Really happy to be here. I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen. That way we can kind of get rocking with everything. So, how is that looking? Can we, oh, it's kind of like taking a sec.
Yeah,
All right.
it's loading here. There we go.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, today, just to really quickly reintroduce everything, this is the Pathways to Discovery Navigating Graduate School Opportunities Workshop. And it should be pretty good. Real quick, I just wanted to give a quick summary of topics. So we're going to cover a lot of stuff today. It's going to be very broad. It might get a little bit shallow at times, just with kind of skipping over a bunch of different things. So feel free to put questions in the chat. But hopefully I'll be able to cover a lot of different things to at least help everyone get like a good understanding of what's going on. So to begin with, real quick, I'll just briefly go over my own background just so you know what is kind of going on with me. So I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. And I kind of went to a small private university in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, called Sewanee, the University of the South. And that was where I kind of really got going with research and things. So at first I started with doing a little bit of work with spotted salamanders, doing some mark recapture stuff. And then I kind of got a little more interested in the evolutionary side of things, and I started working with Microphorus burying beetles. And I thought that was really awesome. And then so after undergraduate stuff kind of ended, I applied and got into NC State's PhD program. And so that's where I'm at now. Like we said, I'm a third year PhD student here, interested in fish eyes. And so one thing I always kind of like to stress is that I didn't necessarily go into undergrad knowing, I was going to try and become a researcher or anything like that. I actually went in just kind of to play football and have fun in the outdoors. And as I kind of got my feet wet doing some different things, at first I did like a horticulture internship one summer. And then I thought I was going to be a park ranger. And then I kind of eventually landed on research. So there's not necessarily like any right or wrong way to go about figuring out what you want to do. Um, and that's kind of what I always like to stress to people. So to begin with, what is and why graduate school in the natural sciences? So, why graduate school? Typically, the purpose of graduate school is because the field or the job you want to go into requires that you need that extra level of expertise or experience, either working with kind of like a research system or some extra coursework or something like that. And so, that's kind of typically why you may want to pursue a graduate degree. You can kind of go or not go for a variety of reasons. But today we'll be really talking about like why you might need a graduate degree. And so I myself am a PhD student, so this might be a little bit more tailored towards like PhD things, but hopefully we'll be able to get it a lot touched on. So there's two major paths in graduate school. You can do a master's and a PhD. I'm going to go over some of the kind of differences there, but quickly, just masters usually they're pretty fast paced and shorter degrees, while PhDs take a little bit longer and may have like a rotation system to them depending on your program. Um, but also just in case you're interested in a variety of different things here, probably there are various things you can do with your degree or alongside your degree, such as like certifications and things, to kind of help push you towards that career you want and goal. And then some of those things you may not even need a degree for. So for example, if you want to be like a wildfire firefighter, you may not necessarily need like a master's in agribusiness or anything like that, but you may need certifications in like using chainsaws and fire safety and thing. So there are pros and cons to everything, and it's largely just kind of dependent on where you see your job kind of going or what you want your career to be. And so, how does a program like this work? So, for masters, this is kind of what I'll touch on first. This is actually available via the NC State Graduate Student Handbook. So, I have a lot more resources from NC State available to me as a student here. But this is largely kind of applicable to a bunch of different programs. So, usually they take about 2 to 3 years. Um, like I said, they're kind of fast paced. So in your second semester, you're already submitting a plan of work, which is basically just saying, like, here's what I'm going to do, here's how I'm going to do it. And then you're getting your committee sent off and kind of solidified, which is just having more people around you, essentially like additional advisors to kind of help get you through everything you're going to do. Um, and so NC State's pretty kind of, they're ambitious with some of their like timelines. So this says like by the fourth semester, you're submitting your thesis. Um, and in some cases it is like that quick, 2 years. Usually they're about two and a half. And while you're doing all this, you're usually taking courses. You might be like teaching or doing research, and kind of doing a bunch of different things at once, kind of just to get you through this master's and establish your expertise. Then PhDs, they're a bit longer. So this is still kind of ambitious where it says like your sixth semester, you're submitting your dissertation. And that may be the case if you already have a master's or something like that. But kind of the general average here at NC State is about 5.5 years. And that largely depends on the institution you're at. So I applied to some other schools and interviewed at other places where if they have a rotational aspect to everything, where you go into the school, but you rotate around some different labs before you kind of solidify on one. That may like add basically an additional year where their average PhD time is like 6.5 years. Um, but also if the average is 5.5 years, there are people here that kind of like get in and crank it out in 4. So a lot of it's up to kind of like what you have available to you, your current expertise and experience. But it's a little bit less fast paced for a PhD. You kind of come in by your third semesters when you're submitting your plan of work. And I mean, by the fourth semester for a master's, you were like submitting your thesis. Um, and then you're taking coursework as well, but you may be done by that third semester. So I personally was done by my third semester. Um, and I've just been doing research and teaching since. I haven't actually been taking any more courses. And that just kind of depends, again, like on you personally and what you might need. Um, but it's a lot more research focused. You're using a lot more time kind of building skills you may need outside of like course material and general knowledge, and applying that knowledge is a lot more of the focus. And so, kind of before I really get into a ton of different things, I did kind of do some work before this, kind of try and assess the general ideas of undergraduate students out here of what they might think hinders them from graduate programs. And so this is generally pretty applicable to a lot of different groups. These were more specific to things like underrepresented groups and minorities, but in large, I found this to just be kind of like the wide views that students have. So the big kind of four things is the cost of graduate school. We know like college is expensive, and a lot of us think, getting another degree is going to cost me that much more money. The GPA kind of academic requirements for graduate school, the difficulty of graduate school, and then the burnout that kind of can be associated with it, and then the general confusion about finding programs. So some of this I'll be addressing as we go, but I do want to kind of touch on a bunch of these currently. So for cost, and I will talk about this a lot later, you should not have to pay for a graduate degree in the natural sciences, regardless of if it's a master's or a PhD. You may get paid more for PhDs and masters, but it is longer. Um, but for a lot of the programs that we're familiar with, like I have a sibling that did an MBA, which is like a master's of business administration, things like law school, med school, all of that is very expensive. But in this field, usually you're teaching or you're doing some sort of research, and you should receive like a stipend, tuition waiver. So you're not actually even paying tuition. And then typically there's some sort of health insurance associated with it. So just quickly to address cost, while it may not be like a lot of money you're getting paid, you should get paid. And that is definitely something to take into account if you're like deciding between programs. GPA requirements. So there are kind of standard requirements to get into the school, and I'll talk about this some later. But once you're actually in the school, the GPA is not a huge deal. They kind of told us like keep your 3.0 to keep your stipend. But like in your courses, there's not going to be as many like high stakes finals and all-nighter projects. It's more kind of to help you solidify some knowledge and expertise that is required for like your research. So they're not high stakes. No one ever asks like, what's your GPA while you're in grad school? And it is a very different kind of experience to how classes are in undergrad. Difficulty and burnout, a lot of that is very personal, but there are a lot of kind of things being set in motion by schools across the nation to kind of make sure we're not like working grad students to the bone, like is kind of the old way of thinking. And so they're doing a really good job at kind of trying to stress, work-life balance. Don't like, spend 12 hours in the lab if you don't have to, things like that. And what is fortunate is you are doing something you're typically pretty interested in, so your threshold for getting burnt out is a little bit higher. Um, but in general, it's a pretty supportive community these days, where as long as kind of like you're getting through your work on a good time and a good schedule, like if you're taking weekends off, no one's gonna be mad about you just because you're not like putting 100% of your time in the lab. And then for general confusion around finding programs, we will discuss this later. That could be a whole other webinar on its own. Um, but I just wanted to address, I know it is very confusing finding these programs. We're going to talk about it. So don't stress too much if these are some of your questions. So applying to graduate school, this is a bit of a word heavy slide, I know. So there are some similarities to the process when you were kind of applying to undergrad, but it is quite different. So there is a cost. You do need to send in some stuff like transcripts and other documents. And then test score requirements may vary by school. This cost to apply does vary by school, and some of them have like waivers you can apply for that to deny these costs. But it is something you might need to think about. Transcripts and things, that's kind of the usual. And then for test scores, there are like some standardized tests, like the GRE is pretty popular. However, all the schools I applied to out of undergrad, and I'll talk about this later, I applied to like 3 different universities, and all of them were basically like, we no longer, require the GRE. So if you take it and you think it helps you, that's fine. Or if a school you're interested in requires it, that is good. But just keep in mind, you have to pay to take that test as well. It's like $200. So there are a lot of free things you can do to study and everything, but really try to make sure you only have to take it, the one time, um, and that your scores are solid to send off. But once again, we're kind of moving away from the GRE, so that might be helpful, hopefully, to a lot of us. So applying to graduate school can vary a lot by institution. So some schools have rotations and emphasize like interviews and things, while others have a very much less formal application process, where really the big thing is you just find a faculty advisor who commits to taking you as a student, and then applying to that school is a little more of like a formality. Um, but regardless of these two processes, the emphasis is really on connecting with faculty you're interested in working with, kind of regardless of if they do rotations or not. So when I was an undergrad, I know my experience is not going to be applicable to everybody's, but just to kind of help give us an idea, I applied to like Vanderbilt, which is a very heavy like molecular microbio, and those kinds of programs are usually heavy on the rotations because they do a lot of like similar but different work. And so you can rotate across a bunch of different labs before you kind of narrow in on who to work with. While here at NC State in biological sciences, I was much more on the like ecology evolution side, not the molecular side. And so that it's less kind of rotationy because you may be going vastly across different systems and questions. You kind of just have someone who like says they'll take you, and then you get into the school. And it's not really like a hardcore system. But for both of those, you need to really like try and connect to these faculty, because even for the interview and rotation style, to make sure you actually connect with them, that's how you get into the interviews. Those people themselves will be the ones that like create the lists. So that's really a big thing. And I'll be talking about how to actually connect with faculty in a second. But that is quite like the thing for graduate school is it's more of like who you work with over where you're going, if that makes sense. So just like a kind of real general timetable, this will vary a lot by institution and style, but for especially like an interview kind of style school, you'll apply somewhere between October and December that fall. Interviews take place like January, February, and then after interviews are done, final decisions are made like February, March. So that's kind of like the general way that schools do it. There are differences. So like NC State, kind of like I said with NC State, it was just like find someone to take you. They're rolling admissions. So once they're like they respond, they're like, "Yep, we'll take you." You kind of apply and get in almost like whenever. I think the deadline was like May or June or something like that when I was applying. Um, so once you kind of locate the people you think are cool to work with, you'll need to find that institution specific like guidelines, which is kind of annoying, but that's just part of the game, unfortunately, right now. So a big thing I also got from a lot of undergrads is what if I lack experience? And then this is something that especially was voiced by groups like underrepresented groups in science. And a great way to do that is to get research experience. Any research experience is good, especially while you're an undergrad, just because it tells professors, I know how research works, and I may know that I don't necessarily like this science or this study system, but I just like know I enjoy research. And that is definitely can be a bit of a hindrance if you have no research experience and want to do like a PhD, because it's a lot of resources for 5 years of a student working in someone's lab. And then if that student takes 2 years to realize they don't want to do it, it's just kind of like a tough situation. So they do like to know that you understand research. However, that is not always the easiest thing to do, especially if you need to work to help put yourself through school and things like that. So what you can do is kind of look at these different opportunities that are available to you, especially like NSF RUs are a really good one. The World Wildlife Fund just had created this bridge program that is specifically tailored to underrepresented groups in science. And then I just met some of these people at a conference earlier this month, actually, called the Minorities in Shark Sciences. And they have a bunch of really good resources. And all of these three different programs, and I'm sure there's a lot more out there, but these ones are really solid programs. They're paid opportunities, so you're getting compensated. It's not like for free or unpaid. You're getting money to do this. You go do research that may not be available to you otherwise, or to at least, if you already have research experience, but you need different research experience, they're good. If you just want any, they're good. Um, and they offer a lot of like additional things, like networking and professional development. That way you're not just kind of like doing grunt work and then going home. You're getting paid. They're covering like a lot of the costs that people don't typically think about with like relocation or if you need to go somewhere for the summer. And then they're also getting you really good research experience. And then if you do have the availability, doing some research at like your institution during the year, something is always awesome. A lot of professors do have funding for undergrads. That way it's like a work study kind of situation, um, where you can have it where part of your coursework is research oriented. That way it's not taking out of your like extra kind of free time if you need to work and uh, or just like to focus on school. So definitely try and look into that. Imposter syndrome is always big, and you may always feel like you lack the amount of necessary experience. But like I said, any experience is good experience. To be able to show someone that you've worked on a project, gotten through it, you kind of understand how the scientific kind of system and method works. It's always really solid. So now we're going to kind of go about how you do like finding a program. So, like I've said a couple times, I just want to emphasize this again. It's really more about who you work with than where you go. Um, so you don't necessarily need to like look up the top 150 like ecology programs and then just apply to like 10 of those schools. And while I'm sure they're like really great programs, there could be someone that you find like your little niche that you're interested in working on in that system, and they may just be at some like smaller school you didn't really think about. And so a lot of people typically just kind of say like, go to Google Scholar and look up like, type in some of your buzzwords, some of the things that you're kind of interested in studying. And that's kind of the way you figure out what's going on. You don't need to type in like entire names of scientific programs or anything. You can literally just put in like, you know, sharks, or if you know a species of shark you want to work for, or if you really want to study like sharks on reefs, things like that. Just kind of like get the ball rolling. You can filter it by what's been done recently, and then you can kind of just see what's been going on. And then you'll be able to like see who the authors are, what universities they're located at, all that kind of stuff. And I would recommend that. That's really cool. It helps you get an understanding like what research is going on and all that good stuff. It's really a smart way of doing it. So let's say hypothetically, I've kind of started looking into these different programs, um, and you may be limited geographically. I was out of undergrad. I know I wanted to stay in the Southeast, so I kind of tailored to the schools of those areas. But say you're kind of looking at some programs and you identify like four different schools that you think are really cool. And then you identify again, like, all right, there's five professors who study what I want to study at all these schools. And we'll say it's like Houston, Boston College, Florida International, and North Carolina. Um, and so you kind of are like, all right, there's five people at each of these. And then you need to figure out, like, I wonder how many are actually taking students. And so behind the scenes, you may think, all right, there's five people at each. That's a pretty wide net. But in reality, it's like there's three at Houston, one at Boston College, two at Florida International, and then UNC might not even have anybody who's taking students. So what you need to kind of do is this is like connecting with that professor, trying to figure out who's doing what is, and this is an example from North Carolina's like biological sciences website. You can kind of click on graduate studies, just go to graduate program, and theirs is interesting in that they actually just have a whole little like search engine of who's accepting students for like the 2024-2025 academic year, has their name, their research area, their tracks. That's not the norm. Usually, instead of having a nice little thing, you can scroll down and then actually figure out who's doing what. Um, you end up kind of just clicking on biological sciences in the program, and then you find something like this. So it'll say find faculty doing research in, and then it's just a bunch of little tabs. And sometimes they have like cool pictures on them. Sometimes it's just like the word evolution and then a big list of names, stuff like that. And so this is kind of like difficult because instead of just applying to like UNC, you have to look into all these different people. And then it's like, all right, I'm not applying to one school. It's like I'm trying to apply to like four people at that school. And it does add kind of a difficult layer to it. But that's how you kind of make sure you work with the correct people. So say I click on evolution on this fish, and then this is usually what you'll find is you kind of get these like lists of headshots and names and like research interest buzzwords. And that's fine. You know, it helps you get like kind of a start chopping down that like wide net you just cast. A lot of times it involves clicking read more because then they'll have a blurb of their actual like system or what they're studying. But the best thing you can probably do is to then go from a person's kind of just like headshot like this to their actual like personal research website. So they'll have like publications there. They'll have like more kind of like in-depth discussions of what their research is that are really cool. And it's definitely an awesome kind of like way to get it figured out of what's going on. Where it becomes tough is there's only, so many hours in a day. And if you're having to click and look at each person's website for one school, that can take a day in and of itself. Um, so it's just kind of like a few different ways you can kind of try and figure out who's doing what. Um, but that's just kind of part of the game right now. I found it to be kind of enjoyable when I would find stuff, but it was difficult. And so once you find all these people, like I said, there's like three people at one school, two people at one, maybe none at one. But originally you just found five people at each school that do what you're interested in. So how do you actually go about reaching out to them, connecting, trying to figure this all out? And so this is actually just copy and pasted. It's a template you can use right off the Applied Ecology website from NC State. I use something very similar to this, but I didn't actually find the template until I was done applying. So this is a good template you can use. And basically, in a short, kind of like brief paragraph, you want to tell the professor you're interested in working with about yourself, what you're doing, how your interests kind of play off of their interests, and then when you're like applying, basically. And so what I really enjoyed about this is it does kind of have like add a few more lines about your background and interests. That's always good. You do always want to bring up that you read a paper of theirs or something like that. If these people are really interesting to you, their work's going to be interesting. So go through, look at some of their papers. Don't necessarily use the very first one unless it's like right with your interest. You're saying you just recently saw it. Um, and just kind of discuss like, hey, I really have like put effort into looking into your stuff. I think it's really cool. And then you can be pretty straight up and just ask like, hey, are you planning on taking new students? It's not taboo to ask. It's not weird to ask. It's almost expected. Um, and so this is kind of like a really good way to do it that I found kind of useful later on in my graduate searching career. Um, Now, professors do get like a million emails a day. There's a really good chance yours is going to get buried in there. And so I did hear a horror story recently where someone had the same email like typed out and then scheduled to be sent to the professors they were interested in every 2 weeks. I wouldn't recommend doing something like that, especially because it seems way less personable and like personal. It's more kind of just like a robotic thing when they realize they got four of the same email. But you can always respond to your own email. So you'll send this one kind of like first, a couple months before the deadline, things like that, just saying you're like interested in all their stuff. Then, a couple weeks before the deadline, if you still haven't heard from them, or if it's been a couple months, I would always like respond to myself so that it bumps up that original message to the top of their inbox, and then just say, reiterate, hey, I just wanted to like check in and kind of get this back at the top of your inbox. I'm interested in your program and everything that's going on at, XYZ institution. And then if you still don't really hear anything, maybe a couple days before the deadline, you can always kind of put one last little thing that's just like, hey, deadline's like later this week. I just still want to express my interest in your work. That's kind of the better way of doing it, I think. I mean, I haven't had any real crazy feedback, but just that way it seems personable. You're saying you're interested in their work, but you're also not hounding them too much. Um, it is an unfortunate part of the process that is being addressed currently, but the general rule of thumb is you're going to have to cold email a lot of professors, which is not always the easiest thing to do. And then the way I kind of found what happened to me was I got, responses from like a third of the professors I emailed, and half of those responses were saying they weren't taking students. So that is being addressed into how to make that a better system so that it's not so kind of cutthroat and just like demoralizing. Um, but you just have to try and kind of put yourself out there and tell them why you're a good student. And then eventually it gets to the right person who does agree with what you're saying, and stuff tends to hopefully work out. So it's pretty good. I mean, it's difficult, but that's kind of how it goes. One big tip also when you're, and I'm trying to leave this up here a lot in case anyone needs to like take a picture of it or like look at it some more. But when you're applying for things like, you know, school and different programs, really talk about what sets you apart. And I'll talk about this some more with grant writing and things in a second. But just because you may just be a student and then you have to like work on the side, and so all you really do is like go to class, then go to work and do homework. That does not mean you don't have things to offer. There are plenty of things to offer. And so I'll talk about this again kind of in a second. And so funding, like I said earlier, with costs, you should get paid for a graduate program in this kind of field. If it's like ecology, evolution, um, anything kind of like biological sciences, things like that, you should get paid. Once you get into like forestry and things, I'm not as certain, but you should probably be getting paid. It's once you hit like med school and like MBAs and like all the different PT programs and things where it is a cost. But for us, if you're an RA or a TA or anything like that, you should get paid. So if you're a teaching assistant, so my personal funding comes from my stipends all from like a teaching assistantship. Here at NC State, I teach a couple labs of the like intro to ecology and evolution um, lab. And so I teach that, get paid for it. I get a tuition waiver, which means I don't need to like pay tuition. I do get health insurance. NC State, I have to pay my fees, but that does vary based on the school. Now I don't get paid a lot, and I'll be very, uh, transparent. I get like about $20,000 a year from my stipend. And then we get $5,000 for the summer from an external grant. And that's kind of my pay. So if I'm trying to support like a family or like somebody else, that's going to be pretty difficult. Um, but if you don't have to have necessarily worry about that right now, it gets the job done, enough. But sources can vary. So it's not just because I'm a TA here does not mean I can't get funding from other sources. So your institution may have different opportunities available. Your PI or just like the principal investigator, who's just like the professor that runs your lab, they may have external grants that include uh, things like salary in them for students. And then there are different things like fellowships. So there's like teaching fellowships and different fellowships through different funding agencies that you can get as well that may not be like based on your institution. So before you commit to a school, the big things you really want to know are where your funding comes from, how much it will be per year. That's always something, when you talk to graduate students in the lab or even just the PIs themselves, that's something to ask. And they should, if they're being weird about it, that may be a red flag, as well as any relevant timelines. So for me, as a graduate student at NC State, as long as I'm in the biological sciences department, have a TA position for me. So that's where my stipend comes from. That's where all that stuff comes from. Certain schools, you may have like a real hard time limit on like 5 years of funding or something like that, as well as a lot of external grants and fellowships may only be there for like 3 years of funding. And so then you need to ask like, okay, if this PI is talking to me and they're like, yeah, we have 3 years of funding, we can take you. Make sure you know what's going on after those 3 years are up. That way you're not kind of suddenly like on a real fast timetable, or you're just kind of having to like pay money or anything like that. So here's what you can do if you're looking into going into graduate school and you're kind of applying and all that fun stuff. So different applications almost always ask you like, what funding have you applied for? And it's not like a deal breaker if you don't have anything there, but it looks good and it can help you out. And then also, if you're applying to funding, there's the chance you get it. So, you want to kind of do those. And so the biggest thing you'll probably ever hear about, especially as you can apply in your last year of undergrad, and then you get one opportunity in your first year or two of graduate school, and that's for the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program, or GRFP. It's like a 5 year program, 3 years of funding, really great opportunity. It's super competitive. So if you don't like get it, it's okay. But it's a really great opportunity to apply for, and it looks good if it's on your applications. This is open to like anybody as an undergraduate. And what I personally really enjoyed about this is you get practice writing for grants, and you also get a lot of feedback. So you have like every reviewer writes you feedback on your stuff. Um, and you not only write a proposal, but you give like a personal statement. And so this is kind of where I want to come back to the whole like everyone has something great to offer. I just went to a workshop on this at this conference a couple weeks ago, and we were talking to NSF people about it, and someone was kind of like, well, what if I don't really have like a lot to offer? And the person from the NSF was literally like, if you have a hobby, if you have an interest in any like life experiences, like there's something you have to offer. And so me personally, like I said, I was an athlete in undergrad. I would always talk about that because, you're in really diverse environments as an athlete, especially at a primarily white institution. Athletics usually tends to be the more diverse groups on campus. It also teaches you like leadership, teamwork, all that stuff, like really easy buzzwords. But um, then people were kind of helping us talk about like, I'm like, I do pottery, and this helps me talk about like these skills I got. Somebody does surfing, somebody did like they would go do camera stuff. Um, so anything you are interested in that you can do is always like something to talk about. Then there's a couple other programs really centered around kind of like underrepresented groups and minorities, uh, and helping out like those kinds of people who typically and in the past have not been able to get a ton of help. And so the Ford Foundation fellowships, and also through the NSF, it's the Louis Stokes Alliances for Minority Participation, like the LSAMP. They both have programs available that you can apply for. I think the Ford Foundation did in the past couple of years stop doing pre-doctoral programs, which is what you would apply for going into your program. Unfortunately, but they have a lot of like programs for while you're in your doctorate program or graduate program, afterwards, things like that. And they're just all there really to help you either support yourself or get that really good kind of like experience beforehand. Right. So just wanted to stress all of that. And now briefly, we can kind of talk about career paths. So the career path largely depends on your degree, but you can do almost anything with any degree that you kind of choose, which is great. Oops, sorry. And so what people typically think the career paths are academia and government work. They're like, if I'm getting a PhD, especially, or if I'm getting a master's or anything, it's like, well, okay, are you doing career in academia or a career in government? And so these two are actually like very, very there's a lot more that meets the eye for these two paths. We could do a whole seminar on just academia and on just government work. Because academia, there's the R1 research institutions like in NC State or a UNC or like a Georgia or LSU, where you get a ton of funding and you teach like 20% of the time, and then 80% of the time it's research. And then there's also like R2 universities, which are a little smaller and get kind of less funding. And then there's like the schools where I went to school, which are primarily undergraduates, like little to no graduate students, as well as being a professor there, it's like 80% teaching, 20% research. So there's a whole lot of diversity in those kind of job opportunities. Smaller schools, I know Kennesaw State is like right down the road from where I'm home, where I call home originally in Atlanta. And you can be like a teaching professor there with a master's. You don't even need like a doctorate to be just like a teaching professor. So there's a lot of different things you can do there, regardless of which kind of degree you choose, as well as government has all sorts of different things available. So there's the typical, like, NSF you can work at, the USDA, the EPA, like Department of like Interior, there's Fish and Wildlife, which everyone kind of thinks about when they're thinking of like government work with a natural sciences degree. But there's still like a ton of different opportunities you can do, regardless on of what branch you're in necessarily. Um, and so that's kind of one thing I want to talk about. Oop. Next is like you're not just limited to those two things, but you can do almost anything you kind of want. So you can do a big thing right now is environmental consulting, where you kind of like work with companies to either make sure you're not like destroying precious habitat and species, as well as you may be limiting like different outputs and things. And so, depending on the different company and what their goals are and what they get hired for, it can be a very different job. As well as this down here in the corner, just data analysts. You develop a ton of skills doing a master's or a PhD in this path, um, that do not limit you to just something that is in like the nature realm. Um, so with all this data work you'll do, you'll learn a lot of different ways of coding depending on your project. You'll definitely do a lot of statistical analyses to where you would be a good fit as like a data scientist or a data analyst or even like a financial analyst, because you get so good at like all these different methods of analysis and working with numbers, to where even though you went to school and studied fish or bats or turtles, because of all these different things you do, now you can have like, if you have a change of heart or if you decide like the path I want is, like a 9 to 5 kind of like desk job with spreadsheets and things, like you are perfectly qualified for something like that. Um, and then even outside of like the actual like hard science and analysis, you do so much like education as a TA sometimes or outreach that, you also have the opportunity to go work in like museums and with different outreach and education groups and like things kind of like working with like the National Park Service, but as an education, person, not necessarily like a park ranger. Um, and you kind of have this role of like discussing science with the community and kind of making it more accessible to a lot of people while not necessarily being in like that experimental role anymore. And that's a really awesome thing. It's like a really good skill to learn, is being able to like talk to people about this stuff. So it's definitely a really interesting path. Kind of regardless of where it takes you, you're qualified for it all. And then there's even like a branching out kind of industry that we haven't had in the past. Um, so if you talk to anyone who's like a chemist, there's like really obvious industry for chemistry. And that's a lot of like kind of big pharma or like drug creation, things like that. And that's something that we haven't really had recently in like the natural sciences. But with the recent kind of pushes of doing like biofuels with algae, and different things like that, and kind of a lot of the environmental ways in which we can sustain ourselves as like a world and as like a human population, not just through like food and things. Um, there's becoming like more and more of an industry, even in food. We're trying to figure out how to make more food for more people, things like that. Um, to where like there's a whole industry that's just beginning, and we don't even know. I mean, I put a question mark on here because we don't know all the options that are open to us yet. And that's part of the kind of the exciting part, especially for people, in my path where I'm already in graduate school, and those of us in undergrad or even high school, kind of figuring out like what's going on with the world and how am I going to be like utilized? Like, what can I help with? And we're just not super sure yet. And it's like kind of the cool part of having to figure out more opportunities. And then I think with that, I should have time for questions. Or if there was anything else we wanted me to kind of hark on a little extra for the last couple minutes we have left before questions.
No, I mean, I was just thinking the entire time about how useful that would have been when I was applying to graduate school. I was like, wow, that's so, you explained it really well. And so I hope everybody who is attending it took some notes because that's that's a really great job. And so I want to thank you as well for giving great advice for graduate school opportunities, and for sharing your experience and recommendations. I do want to open it up to our audience. I see at least one question already submitted. Again, there's still time to submit questions. You can just use the Q&A function and it'll share it with us. So Fiona said that with searching for different people and programs, how do you keep all of the information organized?
Yeah, that's a great question there, actually. And if you ever need me to like reshare my screen, just let me know. But that's an amazing question. So keeping organized can be really difficult, especially if you get a pretty wide net of different institutions and things. Um, so if you're one of those people who likes to keep kind of a spreadsheet, I would recommend that, especially as more and more people kind of come up. I was not the most organized, especially in undergrad. Um, and so I found like I would get these random email responses saying like I'm not taking students from someone I actually had forgotten I reached out to, which definitely was not an amazing look. So I would just recommend, get a spreadsheet, kind of put the person's name in there. It doesn't need to be anything crazy, just like name, institution, like maybe the link to their website. And then you can just say like, have I reached out to them? Yes, no. Like first reach out. Have I followed up? Yes, no. That way it's just like, okay, I haven't seen a response from this person. I don't want to send out like my whole, search through my email. Have I reached out? Yes. Have I found a response? No. You know, something easy like that, I might recommend.
Yeah, I will just add into like a Google Drive with folders for different schools helped me. Um, S wanted to share, they wanted to thank you first for the great talk. And they wanted to know, do you have any more recommendations other than Google Scholar for initially finding programs or research that you're interested in?
Yeah, so Google Scholar is definitely a good way to do it. It can be I mean, Google Scholar is all about finding research articles. So if research articles are still very confusing and difficult to read, it may not be the best at times. So personally, for me, this is just my experience. I still knew I wanted to be in the Southeast, especially out of undergrad. So I was looking for schools kind of in Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, and I only ended up actually applying to like Vanderbilt, Tennessee, and NC State. And it was because I would go to those universities, I would click on, their biological sciences, or a lot of them had like an EEB, so it'd be like ecology, evolutionary biology, program tabs. I would look at the professors there. I'd kind of just scroll through and I would just kind of either look at their research, kind of like little blurbs. It'll just have like a little paragraph, or even their research interests, like buzzwords and websites, and go about it that way. That's a little bit harder because you have to think about what schools would I be interested in going to? Do they have these programs? And then tracking down the faculty. But for me, it worked because I knew like the general area I wanted to be in. And I kind of just would like, major land grant universities usually have pretty solid natural sciences. I just look there and see who did stuff I thought was cool. Hopefully that helps.
That's good information as well. Ricardo has asked, so They're currently out, they've been out of undergrad for about 2 years, and they've been working as a park ranger ever since. Graduated with a 2.9 GPA, and a lot of programs have a 3.0 GPA minimum. So they're wondering if they should take community college courses or get a postgraduate certification to improve their chances, or basically improve their grades to improve their chances, or should they still apply to those programs with the 2.9 GPA?
Yeah, so that's definitely something people an issue people run into is that they're like right below, that threshold. And so what I might recommend is reaching out. A lot of places have like these kind of directors or people on the staff that are there to help you with these kinds of issues. It might be like the director of graduate programs. Sometimes it's like a person dedicated to just like administration. And so you can always reach out and be like, hey, so I know it says 3.0. I had a 2.9 in undergrad. Like, is this like an absolute deal breaker? Or is it kind of just like a threshold? I have work experience. I'm an park ranger, so I have a lot of education experience. Like, I've gotten my hands-on experience. Um, is that of any use? And you can see what they say. You can always try and get a response from a professor, but that's something that's kind of hard to bank on. But if they're like, no, I think you do cool work, thought your park ranger experience is awesome, you know, 2.9, it's 0.1 away. It'll be all right. So I might try and just get somebody from that institution you might be interested in to kind of let you know. Certifications can't hurt if you're interested in, education or like teaching things. That's always something you can stick like a feather in your cap. Um, but when it's those hard thresholds, I kind of lean more towards trying to figure it out, get it like from the horse's mouth. That way, you're not like too far gone if you do the whole application and then it's like a waste of your time and like $70.
Yeah, that I would agree with all of that you said, especially with the park ranger experience will definitely help you with your application. Um, I'm going to ask you another question. So, if you had somebody who was trying to decide between a master's and a PhD, would be some good questions that you should ask yourself to help you decide between the two?
Yeah, that's definitely something I had a lot to think about. But I think the big thing to think about is with a PhD, you're going to be much more specialized in like a real niche expertise. And it's going to be very heavy on research. There are PhDs that are like teaching based or like teaching research based in pedagogy. Um, but I remember in undergrad, I had a very similar question. I was kind of asking a professor about it. And she's like, well, if you get a PhD, you're going to be an expert in something weird like chicken necks. And I kind of chuckled. I was like, I'm not going to be an expert in chicken necks. Like, why would I ever do that? And now I'm like an expert in fish eyes. So it happens. The big thing is if you want a PhD, you're really pointing yourself in the direction of a research based career. And so if you don't really love research, you don't really have a use for a PhD. And then you can save yourself a few years and some time and money. But if you're really into research and you want to do a master's, maybe finalize what you're interested in, that's cool. I personally knew I liked research and I liked studying adaptation. And so I just kind of applied to research programs. I had a little bit of research experience and I just kind of got with the right fit of professor to where my first 2 years was essentially a master's. My first year I came in, I didn't really know. I just was like, he's a good speciation adaptation lab. I'll find something I think is cool. And then the whole fisheye stuff kind of fell into my lab my first and second year. And then that's what I've been going with. A lot of professors may want you to be a little more kind of like direction focused when you get in. But again, that kind of depends on the person. It really matters who you're working with. So you'll luckily be able to kind of weed through that as you go. So masters kind of keeps you still very general, while a PhD is very much research focused.
Yeah, that's great. Um, as far as individuals who might have limited research experience, do you have any ideas of how they can make their application stand out?
Yeah. So if you have limited research experience, a big thing would be to try and just show that you like that research experience you have while limited has been helpful and you kind of know what you want to do. Me personally, a lot of people, especially at like big state schools, may have like years and years of research experience. I had about 1 year like combined across all of college, maybe, and most of it was in a summer internship. But it allowed me to know here's what I really want to do. I have experience doing it, and like I've talked to professors about it and I know this is what I want to do. So you can show like you're passionate about it. And then also just kind of talking up a lot of your personal life experiences, things that make you like a good researcher and a good like graduate student, that you're like a hard worker, or you have these experiences to kind of like show that you're worth the resources.
Are there any professional organizations or societies that you would recommend someone in the natural sciences to join?
So that kind of is a little more specific to what you're interested in studying, I think. And then a lot of them may have like costs and things, which is always a bummer. It may be like for a student, $50 to be a member for the year. Um, so they are good. There's also a lot of like, there's becoming a lot more like free ones. So there's one that's like EREN or Aaron, and it's all about like ecological research for everybody. And it's a really great one. Things like these Zooms and like the smaller things that are more not as much of like a professional society, but all about like being inclusive in the field and minorities and shark sciences. Those are really awesome ones to get involved in because the connections you make through networking will help you a lot, and they'll kind of like help you talk more about what it is like to be in the field, even if you can't get that research experience, or just to like talk to someone who looks like you.
I knew I was going to talk while muted at least one time. All right, we have time for one last question. I just wanted to say, and this is a very important question I want to say. But what should someone look for in a potential advisor or research group? Um, and if you have time, maybe a couple of good questions to ask a potential advisor. Um, is there anything you should do other than just asking that advisor? Should you reach out maybe to some of the lab members in that organization? Just, I know we're at the end here, and that's a big question, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, that's a very big question because at the end of the day, your advisor is kind of like the person you'll almost see the most and interact with the most. Um, and so one thing that like does sour people sometimes on academia is they have a bad advisor who's just kind of like not very nice. So what I would recommend is trying to get at least like a Zoom meeting set up, something like that, so that they can't either like put on a facade over email, or just may not know like who you are. And that way you can not only talk about research, but you can actually really discuss some other stuff just like informally, and you'll get a better idea like, oh, they said some things that were kind of a little off-putting there. Like that's kind of weird. Or if they say things that are really off-putting, and you're like, do I want to work with this person for like 2 to 5 years if this is how they're going to be? Another big one is I would reach out to graduate students. You don't necessarily need to be like super invested in that professor if you even like may not even have a response. But if you're like, hey, I'm interested in working in this lab, I don't know if they're taking students, but I just want to see what it's like to like work with them. And so graduate students are really good usually about being very transparent. And they can be like, hey, they're real difficult, or like, you know, I don't know if like this lifestyle they'll be accepting. For the most part, science is pretty good these days, but just to make sure, it's always good to kind of just check with other people around them. That's like a really big thing I would say, is reach out to graduate students.
You like to keep it real. And I know I just said that was the last question, but while we were answering that, we got one last Q&A question. So let's just get it in there real quick. Because somebody has asked, what things might you look at when applying in terms about if professors or schools will be accepting for LGBTQ plus folks and other marginalized groups?
That is a great question. So personally, I do not necessarily identify with like a ton of marginalized groups, but I've been really working to make sure I take that into account. So we are like in the South, North Carolina State, ag school. So there's definitely a not super accepting sect of the student body, but for the most part, usually even in like heavy red states and things like that, institutions tend to be a bit more accepting. Um, a lot of programs nowadays, even in states where there may not be like DEI stuff, will have kind of outward like groups and things like that to make sure it's an accepting place and you can find that. You can try and see at least like how diverse is their, biological sciences faculty. That'll tell you a lot. Um, and then even if you can just kind of like look at the people, maybe that person's lab group, how diverse is it? Or even if it's not necessarily like how diverse are the people, but how diverse are their backgrounds? Do they come from a bunch of different kind of schools, or is like everyone from a big state school? That might help you tell as well. Um, and then just kind of keeping like the region in mind is always smart. But I have definitely seen, I just met a guy at a conference who's at the University of Tulsa, not a very historically accepting area, but he is very much like outwardly like gay and has a boyfriend. And he's like, the area is not great, but everyone I work with is awesome and like makes me feel really accepted. So that's kind of a good thing to like gauge is usually just the people.
Thank you. Thank you again. We are out of time for today. So, on behalf of Field Inclusive, I want to thank Parker for all of those golden nuggets of great information. And we thank you for sharing, your experiences, those recommendations when it comes to navigating graduate school and graduate school opportunities in the natural sciences. And we thank everyone here who joined us today. We'll continue these conversations as we further our initiatives and work when it comes to amplifying social field safety issues, as well as amplifying minorities in STEM. So please be sure to follow and interact with us on all of our social media channels, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, at the handle at Field Inclusive. And please be sure to visit our website to learn more about our organization and ways that you as an individual or an organization can support us. I'm sure some of you are still on the call waiting to see who's going to win today's giveaway. So I just want to say congratulations to Elise Steenberg. Please make sure that you check your email where you registered for the webinar to claim your prize. And make sure for everyone else, be sure to check out the rest of our virtual Field Inclusive Week events. So tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be closing out Field Inclusive Week 2025 with a bang. So we're going to have a conversation and hear from ornithologist, naturalist, and award-winning writer, poet, and scholar, J. Drew Lanham, in a moderated conversation with Matthew Morgan, who's an environmental educator, as they discuss the story of John James Audubon, art, nature, and controversy. So we hope all of you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us.